Welcome, everybody. This is where we're going to start the recording for tonight's talk. So tonight we have New Hampshire Department of Education Commissioner Frank Edelblut. Thank you again for joining us. We have a really great topic, the microschools and homeschool pods. And so let's get this. We're going to try to get you to be our spotlight. Let's see, how did I do that last time?
You just click the little button in the top right, second from the
right.
Perfect. That has the little dot, and then a square. And each person can actually set that up however they like.
Oh, nice. There you are. You are now
becoming a Zoom
spotlight.
expert.
You are. You are. I think I have you on spotlight now. Great. And you know, your secretary did say you had mad Zoom skills, so you've already helped us tonight on that. Thank you. So I thought it would be appropriate to start tonight's conversation with a little bit of a recap from our first talk a couple weeks ago, where we kind of laid the groundwork for the discussion on homeschool pods and microschools. So can you kind of like even back it up from there and explain the three different types of educational choices that families are able to choose from in New Hampshire?
Sure. So in New Hampshire, we have, like all of the states, a compulsory education system. In New Hampshire, that means that students or children between the ages of 6 and 18 are required to participate in an approved education program. In New Hampshire, we have three types of programs. The first one is one that many people are very familiar with. So our public education programming, and that can come in a traditional format or in a public charter school. All of the charter schools in New Hampshire are public schools and funded through public funding. The second is private school, and many people are familiar with private schools, and we've got lots of different flavors and varieties throughout the state to meet the needs of all kinds of students. And then the third really is a home education program. And so again, any child between the ages of 6 and 18 need to be enrolled in one of those three types of educational programs, approved educational programs here in the state of New Hampshire.
Great, great. And I know that's been confusing because there are different ways that families are able to access VLAX, which is the Virtual Learning Academy Charter School. And so, it gets confusing.
VLAX. So VLAX is one of our public options. So VLAX is a charter school. They have a bit of a unique message. So you are a unique mission in the sense that they serve as a charter school as one of those programs. Now they have a unique instructional model, and I'm gonna probably throughout the night, I'll keep pulling apart the approved educational programs and the instructional model. So they have an online instructional model, but they are a public charter school, and it is possible for a student to enroll as a full-time student in that online virtual academy in that instructional model. In addition to that, the Virtual Learning Academy, or VLAX, also allows students in our traditional public schools, in our private schools, and in our home schools to be able to engage curricular material. So they may not be enrolled as a full-time student in VLAX, but they may be taking courses through the VLAX platform. When they do that, VLAX, of course, is not going to award them a high school diploma if they finish all that programming by graduating from VLAX. Instead, those credits that they're earning at VLAX transfer back to their traditional public school, and it is still the traditional public school that has the overall responsibility for the education, really, and the instruction of that child. They're just using VLAX as one of the tools to be able to accomplish that. And really, hey, one second. Didn't want to cough on the mic. When we talk about those three educational programs, really part of what those three different domains are doing is creating responsibility for the education of the child. And so VLAX both serves as one of those responsible parties for those students that are fully enrolled in that program, but then also provides course access across a really wide array of courses, as well as a unique instructional model being the virtual instructional model to their children and to the students there.
Great. And parents can, even homeschoolers are able to enroll on a part-time basis for VLAX. Is that right?
Yes, quite often that you will have home educated students who maybe are taking some of their curriculum. Parents might be teaching part of it. Maybe they're working with a tutor or another cooperative group for part of their instruction, and they might be also taking classes through VLAX simultaneously in different areas. And so that is quite normal. I can tell you that in the current environment that we're in, we've seen a large increase in requests for VLAX classes, both from students that are trying to enroll full-time in VLAX, from traditional public school students who are trying to access that VLAX course, those VLAX courses, as well as home education students that are trying to access those, to the point where many of the VLAX courses at the present time have been closed because there's no more room. They don't have any more capacity to enroll those students.
Is that something that, to the best of your awareness, VLAX will be continuing to create more opportunities for these classes, or should parents be looking for an alternative if their child is waitlisted?
So we are trying to find ways to move beyond the current backlog. But really, there is a capacity issue in terms of even just trying to scale. When I spoke with Steve Kozakowski, who runs the school, traditionally he might have at this point in time 8,000 credit registrations. He's at 20,000 at this point in time. And so we're really, we're working hard to try and make sure that we can accommodate as many students as possible, but we want to do that well.
Certainly, certainly. No, it's quite reasonable. It's been massive growth for them, certainly. All right.
Actually, we don't know. It could be, we're not really sure. Just if I might just comment a little bit about that. I mean, it's unclear in the current pandemic world, is it possible that there are a number of parents who are uncertain about their education future for their child, and so they're kind of they're putting a marker down in a whole bunch of places. I'm going to register my kid in my traditional school, in VLAX. Maybe I'm thinking about homeschooling because they want to have all these options available to them as the circumstances unfold. There's a lot of ambiguity in the system because there's a lot of ambiguity about what the future health circumstances will look like. And so folks are just trying to make sure that they have options available.
No, that's great. Thank you for explaining that. That's very helpful. One of the other big topics that we discussed initially in our first meeting was about home education statute, which is RSA 193-A.
Yes.
And in that, I'll just read it briefly so people have that right in front of them. It says, home education shall be provided by a parent for his own child unless the provider is otherwise agreed upon by the appropriate parties named in paragraph 2. And that references the New Hampshire Department of Education, the local SAU superintendent, or a private school that may serve as the family's participating agency. Can you help break down what that word provide means?
Sure, I can. And sometimes this particular part of the law gets confusing for folks. So you really have to take that first sentence out of 193A4, Roman numeral 1, and it says the first clause in that sentence says, home education shall be provided by a parent for his own child. As we at the department understand that word provide, the analogy I think I used with you last time, Michelle, which I think you said you liked that analogy.
Yeah, it was great.
But as parents, we provide food for our children, right? And my guess is that not all parents are growing all their own food. Sometimes they rely on grocery stores or restaurants to provide some of that food. And in the same vein, it is not required through that sentence that parents themselves provide direct instruction across all of the subject domains for their children, but rather it is a function of who's responsible for the education. Going back to the beginning, we have these 3 educational domains, whether it's public, private, or a home education program. And really what we're establishing is who is responsible for the education, for providing that education for that child, not how that is actually delivered. It was interesting. I've seen that that word provide is used not even in just its own context, but even in our public school context where school administrators are providing education. But we know that those administrators are not providing direct instruction to all of the students in the school. So when we look at provide, we understand that very broadly in terms of, student or parents are responsible for the education of their students and their children, and they are going to provide that through a variety of means, which may include direct instruction by the parent, may include buying some an online course. It may involve participating in a cooperative. It may involve enrolling a student in VLAX. It may involve taking a class at the public school system as a curricular participant in that traditional public school, which, homeschool students are allowed to do as well. So that's really what provide is. And then the second clause that it talks about, and really it's only if that first clause is not satisfied, that the parent is not able to provide. And then it says, unless the provider is as otherwise agreed upon by the appropriate parties named in paragraph 2, which as you enumerated is the department, the resident district superintendent, or a non-public school person. So you could imagine that it's possible that a parent files an intent to home educate and they intend to provide for their child, but for whatever reason, they're not able to provide that education. Perhaps they become incapacitated. It's a terrible thought, but those things can happen. And in those cases, whoever that guardian is might look to the department, the resident district superintendent, or a non-public school in order to help them provide that education because the parent is no longer in the picture relative to that provision.
Oh, that's very helpful. That really explains that second half and does a lot to clarify that. Thank you so much. So the heart of today's topic is the whole concept of a homeschool pod or micro school. Can you tell folks what exactly this is? Because the word homeschool pod is a relatively new concept. It's a new term. So how would you define that for people?
Probably a new term, but definitely not a new structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually want to, again, I'm going to use this analogy. I'm going to tear these two things apart because when you talk about a homeschool, micro school, or pod school, what we've really got going on there are two different things. We have one of our legal structure, which is home education program, right? Which is in statute. That's one of our three things. And then really the micro school is the instructional model that's being used. So a student who is of the compulsory age, so they're between the ages of 6 and 18, they're required to be enrolled in one of those programs. It is possible that a student who is a home education program student is participating in a micro school or a pod school, which may mean that they are learning. And generally a micro school or a pod school consists of a smaller cohort of children. It's generally multi-age, and they collaborate with one another in terms of the instruction. And so you could have a micro school that only centers around one subject. Perhaps you're home educating your student and they get together with a group of students that is centered only around maybe their language arts learning. And they've got kind of this little micropod that is working on the on language arts instruction together in that process. It could be that you decide that you're going to work with a group of another group of students collectively across a whole domain of subjects. And so maybe you're doing most of your instructional activities in this kind of cooperative way in a limited cohort size that allows you to create really a very enriching instructional model for a child. And so again, that's why I try to differentiate the difference between you're in a home education program, but you've chosen an instructional model for, in the examples I gave, either English language arts only, or perhaps a broader array of subjects that you're working on, but you're still enrolled in a home education program, but you're involved in that micro school instructional model that you're engaged in.
Okay, so to do this sort of at-home group learning, does the family have to be part of an official micro school program or have any kind of formal structure to it to make it count? Does that matter?
Yeah. So again, a student needs to be enrolled in one of the three, either public, traditional, or charter, a private school, or a home education program. Again, that is kind of the legal structure that you're enrolled in. And then you've got an instructional model. It's quite possible for a student in a traditional public school, that a traditional public school could form an instructional model of a micropod. They may pull out and carve out a group of students in a smaller cohort that is multi-age and is working on a particular type of curricular instructional area. Or perhaps they would carve out a broader one. But again, trying to separate the difference between that instructional model versus the legal structure under which that's happening. So in the event, excuse me, I've been talking too much today. This is the last event, my last Zoom call today. But in the event that, if someone is home educating, then again, the parent is responsible for providing that education. And so if they elect to participate in a micropod or a, educational or micro school environment, that's an instructional model that they are able to choose for their student, for their child to participate in. And I would hope that they would do that because they see that as, an instructional model that they think is going to meet the needs of the child.
Great, great. So does it matter who is the instructor or the facilitator for these homeschool pods or micro schools? Is there does it have to be a certified teacher? I mean, it can be certainly a bonus, but is that required?
So it wouldn't be required. And again, at the end of the day, if we assume, like I'm trying to make sure I follow your thread all the way through. So we're assuming that these are students who are of compulsory age, who have filed an intent to home educate, so they're enrolled in a home education program. So the parents are required to provide that education and maybe be calling in extra resources. It could be a certified teacher, it could be an outside expert. And then what's happening, so that expert that they bring in is not the responsible party. They may be responsible to the parent, but the parent is still responsible to the state for the ultimate education of that child because they have that providing requirement in statute. So it would be inherent upon the parent to just make sure that they're putting them into an instructional model that's going to work for them and then supports their student, which is, I think, the decision that most parents would want to make anyways.
Got it. Got it. So does the department have, is there like a certification program for tutors? I know there certainly is for teachers. There's a rigorous process, but is there something similar to that for tutors?
There is not. We do not credential tutors at the Department of Education. And so really a tutor is just anybody who's got capacity to be able to teach, children. And I think that that's going to really be a very broad spectrum of individuals who may participate in something like that. If your child, depends on what your child's interested in. It was interesting. I was on a call the other day and we were talking about glass blowers. And, we don't have a program for certified glass blowers, art teachers, right? But there's probably a lot of very skilled glass blowers out there in the marketplace who might be really good at helping to, instruct and nurture a curiosity about the art of glass blowing in the life of a student. And so we would hope and we would encourage, parents to engage that. It goes a little bit along with, another program that we have here at the department, Learn Everywhere, where we're trying to create opportunities for students to pursue their curious interests and allow that learning that takes place in all kinds of environments to be recognized throughout the process.
That actually hits on a topic I was just thinking about that I want to jump back to in a little bit. So getting back to who can be helping out with this homeschool pod or small group, can a family simply tap into the resources of friends, neighbors, family members to help supervise their children during the day? So it's not necessarily someone who's being a paid instructor, but just somebody to help supervise the kids. Is that perfectly good too?
Yeah, as long as they're enrolled in an education program, right? So that
Right.
the adults who are working with those kids are working towards the educational goals of that home education program.
Got it. Now we've seen a few, I've heard rumblings that parents and teachers are being told that homeschool pods and micro schools are illegal, that they somehow are circumventing the approval and review process that the Department of Ed and the State Board of Education go through for private schools. It would seem, given how often you've said this now, that these would be perfectly legal, that this isn't a legal barrier for homeschool pods or
I mean,
microschools.
again, so the legal structures are these three, right? So
Yep.
it's public, traditional, or charter, private, or home education program. And in that home education program, the parent is required to provide the education, which basically establishes the responsibility for the education of that child. And the parent, in the provision of that education, may use a variety of resources in order to allow that to happen. I mean, so just imagine, maybe this is another way that will help make this clear. We have in our statute the ability for students who are enrolled in a home education program to participate in curricular and co-curricular activities at the traditional public school to which they are assigned.
Right.
So clearly, in that case, the parent is not going to the classroom. Like, let's say that you have a home education student who's taking a calculus class at the local high school. The parent is not going into the calculus class and providing direct instruction to that student. In fact, that would be, antithetical to what's happening, right? The student is going to the calculus class and hearing from that certified calculus math teacher and learning the calculus. So the parent in that case is not providing the direct instruction. The parent is not present in the classroom. The parent is, and so the student is there and they're getting their instruction. But at the end of the day, the school, that public school where that child is taking calculus, is not ultimately responsible for the education of that child. The parent who filed the intent to home educate is. But you can see in that example, is that a good, maybe a good example, that so the parent is not there. It's a third party who's being paid to teach the class and the kids participating. And that is a legitimate construct within our law.
Okay. So that actually brings up a important part that a lot of families have questions about is what requirements would a facility have or a microschool have for complying with the Department of Health and Human Services requirements. So whether it's you had mentioned in our previous discussion a few weeks ago that if the child is of school age, then those daycare requirements did not apply. But
if the child is in an education program.
Right. So if that child is registered as a public schooler, a private school student, or a home educated student, is that correct?
Correct. So they would need, in other words, so there's a difference between, it is, if you're running just a daycare center, so you're not providing an education program, then that requires licensure by Health and Human Services as a daycare center. And there's various rules and regulations associated with it. That's not the same thing as an education program. And so if a child is involved in an education program, then that falls under the domain of the Department of Education and our regulatory schema for those three types of constructs that we've discussed.
Okay, so here's where there seems to be overlap or confusion. So if a facility, whether it's some of these places that are opening themselves to be remote learning centers, do they have to follow these Department of Health and Human Services regulations, if like for number of children that they can accommodate, school nurse, providing transportation, or does this, how does that fall into there? If they're a center, but they're not the education provider, how does that work?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different configurations for how this could come together, but let's assume, because this is the circumstance that we see on the ground often today. So we have students who are enrolled in a public school program, traditional public school program. The public school program is only offering programming in person 2 days a week. So those students 3 days a week are going to be attending one of these other learning centers. So let's say the roller skating rink in a particular town is setting up, and they are going to supervise those children. So in that particular case, they are not providing the education program. The school is the education program. And so then they are a daycare center in the sense of the word, that they are really just supervising the children, but the individual responsible for the education of the child is the school. And does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does make sense.
Confused.
No, that's all good.
So
all
they
right.
would be required. They would be required to be licensure.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good, because there's been a lot more of these businesses that are pivoting their model and what they're offering. And
every day there's another news article about another organization opening up, and it's good to see that they're trying to meet the needs of their communities, and that's great.
yes, definitely. So that brings up a question that we're seeing a lot. Are there financial assistance possibilities for these parents who do need to tap into a pod or hire an instructor or use these drop-off facilities to supervise their children so they can return to work? Are there funding sources for them?
So again, I have to come back to the funding sources are going to flow through the educational program that exists, right? So a traditional public school is the legal entity that receives the local and the state taxes to be able to support how they are going to, hang on, I just got a little internet glitch there. They have broad flexibility in terms of how they're going to meet the needs of their students. Whether it's through a manifest education hardship, they have flexibility. Best interest of the child, they have flexibility. An SBA, whether or not they have a school in their district that is the age for the child. So there's a lot of different ways that the local district could determine if they wanted to be able to support that. But they may say, like, well, we can support the education, so we don't need that. So again, the funding is going to come through one of those three structures. It could be a private school that is, again, the parent is typically in a private school, pays tuition to the private school. And if the private school is only offering instruction for 2 days a week, and they say, hey, because you've paid tuition for 5 days a week, we're going to pay for this aftercare program or these other day program care for your student. But again, it comes through that legal entity. If you're a home education family and you need care for your student, you're going to pay for that. You're also going to pay for the educational programming for your child as well.
Got it.
So if you're paying for care, then that is a Health and Human Services licensure process. Education programming is the responsibility of the parent, whether that's paid or it's volunteer through a cooperative or something else that you're going to be using.
Okay. So for these kids who are not yet of school age, those kids who are like in that, especially that kindergarten year where it's optional, that
5 years old, yeah.
Right, those 5-year-olds who are not quite 6 years old by the compulsory date of September 30th. What's hanging up a lot of people is, do they fall under the daycare requirements or do they fall under the education requirements if a parent chooses to enroll them? Because kindergarten is optional. Parents could enroll them in a public kindergarten or a private kindergarten. So what should these kindergarten parents keep in mind?
So if I were a home education parent and I was looking at kindergarten, the first question I would ask, if that student is going to an education program, let's say, excuse me, a family has a second grader, but they also have a kindergartner.
Yep.
And they're going to go and participate in that pod along with the family member, and they are active participants in that educational programming. My guess is that would fall under the educational programming. If, however, you have a non-compulsory age student who's going to an education program, and I don't know if I know the answer to this, I would have to get this answer for you. If they're going to an education program and they're non-compulsory age, does that fall under HHS or Department of Education? I don't know the answer to that. You might have like a little donut hole there that we'd have to figure out.
Okay, because I think that donut hole is a real concern for a number of families.
Okay.
If we can circle back to that with your legal team at some point, that would be helpful.
Okay.
So I think that would be really great. Thank you, sir.
Great.
So I want to circle back to another common question about the licensing for these organizations that might try to provide remote learning supervision.
Yep.
It's if they provide education, is it so? But it's not,
It's not
quite. It's not
education
a school,
programming. Yeah, it's
right?
not an education. It's not
Okay,
one of the three. So
got it. Okay,
HHS.
okay. So if they provide enrichment or they provide supervision or on-site tutoring, that's not quite the same. That falls under the
Yeah.
DHHS.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. All right. Would these pods have to fulfill, to the best of your knowledge, would these co-ops or self-formed groups have any COVID particular protocols that they're required to follow according to, or can they self-choose what protocols they're comfortable with?
So it would depend again. So this is again how that comes through, like what that looks like. So we
Got it.
have provided guidance to our public schools and our private schools, and it's a document that's K-12 school reopening guidance, and it provides a lot of information about how schools can safely reopen. So would want to encourage them to take a look at that guidance. In terms of, if it's a home education program and students are participating in that, they would be subject to the executive orders that exist. It wouldn't qualify probably as a pod if there were more than 100 kids there. So at that point in time, I don't think that would work. But I do think that it would be appropriate for families who are participating in these groups to consider what types of mitigation strategies they might put in place and not be careless. I would also tell you that one of the advantages of the pod or the micro school, and one of the reasons why many families are considering this type of an option, is because of the limited cohort aspect of it, right? If they find themselves in that traditional school, which would also include many times that traditional instructional environment, there's the possibility of there being a greater exposure to higher numbers of children. And so that may increase the risk. But if you're in a, in a micro school, that you're going to be working with the same 8 or 10, you're cohorting with the same 8 or 10 students throughout the entire semester, then that obviously that alone is a risk mitigating factor. I mean, if you imagine, that is one of the things that we're doing in the traditional public school, is creating kind of these micropods in the school. So many schools are adopting what they refer to as hybrid schedules. And in that hybrid schedule, what they're really doing is they're saying, we're not going to put so many kids together, we're only going to take half at a time. So instead of having 20 kids in the class, we're only going to have 10 kids in the class at a time. So in essence, they've kind of created their own little micro school. The reason why you do that is because of the mitigating factors associated with COVID. So a micro school inherently has that protective factor built into it by its nature, by the very design of the instructional model.
Got it. That's very helpful. Thank you. Are there currently some sorts of learning communities or co-ops or micro schools that have been around New Hampshire that families might want to know about?
Yeah, I mean, there are several. The two that come to mind immediately is I would encourage you to reach out to Big Fish. Diane Murphy over in Dover runs Big Fish. Kind of a cool name, but she has been doing this for some amount of time. Diane is a 30-year certified educator and highly qualified, and does a great job with the students who participate with her. In her particular model, students do file a intent to home educate when they join her program, but she has a facility where they come and they participate in their instruction based upon the individualized schedules of the individual students. Another one is Straight A Academy in Bedford. Felix runs that program and does a great job with that. A little bit different structure in terms of his academic setup, but another individual who can provide some of that individualized pod or tutoring working with students. And again, that's the kind of thing you might engage on a full-time basis. You might engage on a part-time basis with them if you're a home education student.
So you're telling me this whole micro school pod concept really isn't a brand new idea. It's been around a while.
Well, I mean, it has been around a while, and I know that that's a facetious question because it's been around a while.
Yeah.
And I probably should also have mentioned, throughout the state, we have a number of co-ops
Right.
homeschool co-ops. And so it's very normal for homeschool students to get together. Sometimes it's a couple days a week, maybe sometimes it's just one day a week. Maybe it's in the morning or an afternoon or for the day, and they get together and maybe they do some collective instruction around art or language arts or history. And so they prepare and they work together to do that. There is another opportunity for students too that we've seen. I don't know of any that are set up in the state, but prendaschool.com
Right.
is another micro school. You see that more prevalently down in Arizona.
Right.
Yeah, Arizona is really a little bit more prevalent, but I do know that there have been a number of families and some of our traditional schools who are considering those as options for their students who need that type of support. I had a conversation today with the superintendent of one of our schools as they are trying to find options for their family and tools that they can use to help support their students.
Right. I know Prenda has a couple different models. They have a model that parents or families can choose to facilitate on their own and use their curriculum and approach to learning. Is there currently any effort or interest in Prenda being offered through the public schools like it is in Arizona, where the funding follows the child to Prenda, but it's as a component of the public school option? Is that something?
Well, so it is. I mean, I've had conversations with superintendents about that as an option. But as you point out, the funding stream is not direct from state to Prenda, but it would flow through with that student, that school district who has responsibility for that student. It would flow through the district to the Prenda school option. And
Okay.
I do know that, Prenda has had conversations with several of our New Hampshire superintendents to explain kind of what the options are and how they might deploy that.
So if a family was interested in that option, should they maybe express that interest to their own SAUs?
That would be great. I know that superintendents are working hard to try and come up with options that support their students in their district. And if they've come up with a plan that isn't working well for you, and you think that a micro school or a Prenda type of an option might better fit your family, or maybe even a cohort of families in your district, I would encourage you to talk to your principal, talk to your superintendent, and say, "Hey, we would like to do this. Can you work with us in that vein?"
Okay, great. No, it's good feedback for the districts to know what their community
The
is
options
interested
that
in.
are available. Yeah.
Right, great. We touched on funding. So some people have expressed curiosity about how the funding works if a student is no longer enrolled in their local public school. How does that funding work? How does that impact their local schools? Some people have been told that withdrawing their children from enrollment means that the public schools will lose funding for 3 years. So can you explain that element so parents know what's happening to the funding?
Right. So we actually pay adequacy a year in arrears. So the easiest way to think about it is there's two components to the school funding. There is the state component and the local property tax component. So when a student unenrolls from a public school, again, we pay in arrears. So the next year, if that student is unenrolled for that entire year, then the adequacy funding that would normally follow that student would not be paid in that subsequent year. If the student re-enrolled, at whatever point they re-enrolled, then the district would receive the funding for that portion of the state. So let's say that the average cost of education is about $17,000 per student. School districts receive about $7,000, actually a little bit more, but let's just for rough numbers, we'll say $7,000 of state funding and about $10,000 of local funding. So when that student leaves the school district, in that first year, there will be no effect on the district's funding. But in that subsequent year, after the student has left and enrolled to homeschool, the district would receive the local tax portion, but they would not receive the $7,000 state portion.
Okay. So there's
I'm just going to, one more clarification. We actually do it on attendance, so that if a parent were to leave a public school district for half of a year, then we would still count that student as enrolled for the second half of the year for purposes of calculating the adequacy payment to the district. So it is proportionally adjusted. It's not either on, it's not an on or an off.
Okay. So the family, it seems like there's a lag. There's a 1 year
There's
lag.
a 1 year lag, exactly. Because we
Okay.
pay in arrears. We don't know who's enrolled until we get to the end of the year, and then we know
Right.
how. So essentially, we're paying on the number of days a student is enrolled. So we got to go through a whole year so we know how many days the student was enrolled in that school, and that's what we'll pay for. So if a school district was halfway through a year and a new family moved in and they enrolled in that school district for half of the year, then they would receive funding for that half of the year when those students were enrolled. So so it's paid 1 year in arrears based upon the attendance.
Okay. So if a family is working, let's use VLAX as the example, since that is a remote option that many districts are using. If a family is plugging into VLAX as the offered remote option for their district, they're still considered a student of the local public school, and the funding still stays with the local public school.
That's correct, unless they unenroll in the public school and re-enroll in another one of those three options that they have, that school would continue to receive their funding.
Okay. And if this family then is full-time enrolled in VLAX, it's VLAX that gets
Correct.
the
Now
state portion.
Because now they're in a public charter school, and that's who's enrolled and who's responsible for their education. Exactly.
And the local public schools still receive their portion of the local property taxes. That still stays in district.
Correct. The property tax is not affected by that.
Right. So a family that does choose to withdraw their child and home educate, all the local property taxes still stay with the district.
Stays local, yes.
That stays local whether the child stays enrolled there or not.
Yeah, it's only the state portion that is a per capita payment that is made based on the student's, adequacy.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for explaining that. I know there's been a lot of swirling questions about funding. It's a big issue. Okay. Another question that has come up is, and you touched on this, with Learn Everywhere being another way at the high school level that traditional public school kids are able to get credit by doing other activities or pursuits. And it doesn't have to be other outside education providers strictly. It can be volunteer work or a number of different activities that can qualify for credit. Is that right?
They have to be approved programs.
Right.
So once a program is approved, and again, we just got approval for the Learn Everywhere program. So today we don't have any Learn Everywhere programs established, but we will establish programs as we go forward. And for whatever programs get established, those would be opportunities for students to earn credit, leading to graduation for up to 1/3 of their graduation credits, through these outside programs.
And it piggybacks on a well-established mechanism in the public schools called extended learning opportunities, ELOs, that the district authorizes for their own students.
That's right.
So the reason I bring this up is that a lot of families who have high school age students are very concerned about transferring credits should they go from a homeschool environment back to a public school at some point, because some of the new homeschoolers may or may not stay long term. This might just be for a few months or even just a given year. They don't know yet because there's just that kind of uncertainty right now.
Right.
The concern is that if a parent is home educating, that the superintendents have the discretion about what credits, and I use that term very loosely, but what sort of credits their high school aged homeschool student would be able to get if they return to the local public schools. And even VLAX credits, some districts are reluctant to accept. So what are the issues that a parent of a high school age student should be concerned about for those credits or transferring back to the public schools?
Right. And so just to clarify, so it wouldn't be the superintendent who would adjudicate whether or not they would accept those credits, but the principal of the high school that the student would transfer back to.
Okay.
And so what I would encourage families to do if they intend to home educate because of the current circumstances and they're trying to figure out there's a lot of ambiguity, what am I going to do? I'm worried about my child and the education. I would encourage them to reach out to their principal and say, I'm going to be home educating this year. I don't know if I'm going to do this for the whole year. I don't know if I'm going to do it for 2 years or whatever, but I'm concerned about transferring credits back in. So can I work with that principal in that school and understand what is the curriculum that the district will be using? And maybe the district will even be able to share that curriculum with them so that they can actually stay exactly on track with their peers in that system. So if they make the determination, they say, I want to come back in, that they are able to do that. That would be the first place that I would start. The second is that every high school publishes what they refer to as the graduation requirements, and that enumerates the various classes and credits that a student is required to earn in order to attain a high school diploma from that district. And so when you're setting up your courses, consider what those are if you think that you may be transferring back, and take classes that are going to align with the graduation requirements for that particular high school. Because it could be that your high school has a very unique or obscure class. Maybe they want you to take an integrated, arts, ELA, and chemistry class,
Mm-hmm.
and you may not be able to find that somewhere else. Maybe that's unique to that district, but that's a requirement that that district wants you to have to graduate. So you're going to want to work closely with your district to make sure that you understand what the graduation requirements are, so that when you decide that you want to transfer back in, it's easy for the district to understand how the work that you've been doing as a home education family transfers back into their system, so to speak.
Got it. Got it. And would it be advantageous to that homeschool family to seek accredited programs that might, or is that optional? Is that
That's optional. Yeah.
Got it.
I mean, again, that would be the question that you might want to ask to the principal if you think that there's going to be a concern. But we have seen many, many homeschool students who have transferred into schools and they don't have any difficulty. Maybe they transfer in, as a junior, and, they've taken an algebra and a geometry class, and the schools just take it, and the kid gets into algebra 2 and they do fine and everybody's happy. So most of the time it's a relatively seamless transition.
Okay. Because I know sometimes districts in their homeschool policy will say they reference placement tests, and math or a world language readily can be tested. But some of these other credits can't be quite so smoothly.
But the credits that can't be so easily assessed are generally credits that are easier for the school to accept because they don't fit into their overall accountability system anyways. So it is really, if you have that assessment which is required for home education families anyways, relative to the math and the English, then I think you're going to be in good shape.
Okay, that's helpful because a lot of families are finding themselves concerned,
I think that's great. I appreciate that, all the planning that's going in and the foresight, and just thinking like, okay, if I'm going to make this decision, what are the ramifications of this? How does this fit in contextually?
No, absolutely. Okay, super. We have some more follow-up questions. I've been plugging into those questions as we've gone along, but there's some particular ones. If a learning center opens up for supervising remote learning and adds on enrichment opportunities to supplement as optional things, does that then make the DHHS childcare requirements still applicable? Because
they're not not one of the 3 programs, right? So this really, that's the distinguishing factor, right?
Okay.
So what is that program that's taking place? So you have to be enrolled in one of those programs.
Got it. Okay. I think so it's got to be one of those 3, or it falls under DHHS.
That's correct. If
Got
they're
it.
supervising children.
Okay. So, all right. Because I've done some research on this on their website, and it's
The
less than
402, the 402 rules then, right?
yeah, it's been less than clear sometimes, as because this is we have businesses all over the state pivoting and offering things in a unique way, and so making sure that everything is followed the way it's supposed to be has been a little bit new.
Well, I mean, I think that what you also find is HHS is working hard to create a lot of these emergency licensures for these places that are opening up that are supporting families, because the families otherwise are having difficulty going back to work because they don't have someone to watch their children on those days when they're not in the school system.
Right, right. No, and everybody's trying to figure that out. There are districts that haven't fully announced what their plans are, and parents are like, what do I do here?" So it's hard to have that crystal ball. We're trying to figure it out. So we
Well,
have.
hopefully that's clear now though, right? Like you have education programming, right? And you have to be enrolled in one of those.
Perfect. Thank you for making that so clear and reiterating it repeat often for us. It's been helpful. Before we close things out, and we've got just a few minutes left, are there any other bits of announcements that you would like to share with the homeschool community, or bits of encouragement that you'd like to share with families who are still maybe homeschooling for the first time or still trying to decide what the right fit is? What could you advise us?
Right. So, and again, I don't know who all is here, who all is going to be listening to this, but there are a couple of things. So one is, and I don't want to, I'm going to say something and I'm likely to get myself into trouble because, education itself is enriching wherever you're learning. Learning is great. I love learning. I will tell you that, home education can be a really enriching opportunity for you to build a close relationship with your children if you're involved in that because of the very nature of what it is that you're doing. If you're embarking on this for your first time, my two pieces of advice are be flexible with your child and be flexible with yourself. It doesn't, oftentimes I often refer to home education as, and I try not to say homeschool. Because the goal in a home education program is not to replicate school at home, but to really educate in a different way that explores and allows children to really exercise that inherent curiosity that they have to pursue their interests. And then you just as the parent are able to help nurture and encourage that in a way that brings that child through that learning experience, and they acquire all of the same information that they otherwise might acquire, maybe even more, as they're exploring their interests that they might get in a traditional instructional environment. Because again, students are learning everywhere and all the time, with or without us. Our goal is just to help continue to encourage that. And we want to avoid the idea that learning is isolated to a building or a program or something like that.
Wonderful. Is there any other little bits? I don't want to, not ask the burning question that you've for information you wanted to share with families tonight.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you have done a great job facilitating this conversation. I really appreciate it. And again, we at the department are there to support you in whatever decision that you make and however you want to proceed with the education of your child. So feel free to reach out to the department if you have questions or concerns, or even if you're exploring. I mean, honest, this is like a real and open invitation to not hesitate to reach out to the Department of Education and ask us questions, particularly in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. It's ambiguous. I literally had probably 50 emails this morning from families asking questions about, if my school does this, what does this mean? And how can I do this? And what about this? And we're happy to answer them. That is why we're there. We work for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time and availability. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for spending yet another hour with us and being very patient as we go through these issues so that parents feel they've been fully addressed. So thank you, Commissioner Edelblut, for all your time and expertise and generosity with your knowledge. So folks, will be recorded. This is recorded. We will be sharing this on our website and social media as soon as I can get all that going. I'll be working hard to get that up as quickly as possible. And we want to continue to let people know Granite State Home Educators has a group specifically for families who are looking to connect in a homeschool pod or microschool setup. Excuse me, it's called GSHE Homeschool Pod Connections. It's on Facebook. We also have a more standard traditional support group that's just called Granite State Home Educators. We have over 3,500 members there, and it's growing exponentially as new families are looking to find information and connect in with other folks. So find us there if you're looking for more information on that. And thank you again, Commissioner. You've been wonderful and very generous. Thank you for your time tonight.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.